The fluorescent lights hum their ceaseless drone above the emergency department at Sacred Heart Hospital in Houston, a sound like insects trapped in plastic, and Elena Martinez has learned to move through it as if the sound belongs to someone else's life. She arrives at 6:02 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, her badge clipped to the pocket of her scrubs, her name in simple white letters, Elena RN. Nothing more. She does not want more. Her hands are steady as she checks the assignment board, Trauma Bay 3, post-op monitoring in ICU, 3 new admits in the holding area, and she absorbs the information with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from reading situations where hesitation costs lives. She has done this before. Not here. But she has done it. The ER smells like antiseptic and industrial coffee and something underneath that copper, maybe, or just the memory of it. Elena moves through the corridor without looking anyone in the eye, nodding once at the charge nurse, then sliding into her first patient's room without any announcement of herself. The woman in bed 2 is post-operative from a laparoscopic cholecystectomy, vitals stable, dressing dry. Elena's hands move with the precision of someone who has performed these checks 10,000 times. She does not need to think. Her hands know the work. She wraps a blood pressure cuff around the woman's arm, watches the numbers climb and settle, writes them in the chart with the kind of neat, economical handwriting that takes up as little space as possible. The patient tries to make conversation. How long have you worked here? Are you from Houston? And Elena responds in the voice she uses for everyone, soft, respectful, deflecting. You're healing well. I'll be back to check on you in an hour. Not her name. Not her story. Never her story. By 8:15 a.m., Elena is in the staff locker room on the 3rd floor, the one that most of the residents never use, the one that smells like metal and damp fabric and forgotten lunches. Her locker is 347. She opens it slowly, not because she is hesitant, but because some things deserve to be approached with intention. Her spare scrubs hang on a hook. 2 pairs of socks. A name tag she never wears. And on the bottom, wrapped in thick plastic like something evidence, sits a pair of combat boots. They are worn. The leather is cracked in places, water-stained, the laces knotted at the eyelets with the kind of knots that come from muscle memory and 17 years of muscle memory becoming muscle fact. The mud in the treads is from Kandahar, though no one at Sacred Heart would know Kandahar from a city in Ohio. The sole is worn through in places where her feet pressed hard against rocky ground while carrying something that mattered more than her own weight. Elena's hand hovers over the boots for exactly 3 seconds. She does not touch them. She does not unwrap them. She never does. They are the only thing she kept. When she left the Coast Guard 7 years ago, when her hand started to shake at things she could not name, when the PTSD made her flinch at doors closing and her therapist suggested she find work that was quiet, repetitive, invisible, she packed everything else away. Her uniforms went to a consignment shop. Her medals are in a safety deposit box at Wells Fargo that she has not opened in 4 years. Her discharge papers are filed in a cabinet at home next to her marriage license and her husband's death certificate, both documents that separate the woman she was from the person she became. But the boots stayed. The boots stayed because they were the only things she had ever owned that were honest. She closes the locker without sound and returns to the ER. By noon, Elena has restarted 3/4, caught a pharmacy error on a vancomycin order. She simply pointed at the dose on the chart and looked at the pharmacist without speaking, and he caught his mistake in real time, nodded at her in gratitude, and helped deliver a baby in Trauma Bay 1 when the OB attending was in an emergency C-section across the hall. She coached the mother through contractions with a voice that carried absolute certainty. Next contraction in 30 seconds. You are doing this exactly right. Breathe when you can. Push when your body tells you to. The baby came at 12:08 p.m., 7 pounds 4 ounces, and Elena wrapped him in a warm blanket from the bear hugger and placed him on his mother's chest without ceremony, the way someone places something precious that they have no right to keep. The mother cried. Elena squeezed her shoulder once and left before anyone could ask her name, because this was the problem with doing good work in a hospital. Eventually people wanted to know who you were. The announcement came over the intercom at 1:44 p.m. All senior staff to conference room B mandatory meeting. Elena continued checking the monitor on her patient in Trauma Bay 4, a 38-year-old man with a stab wound to the abdomen that had caught the spleen. He was stable for now. She had placed the two 18-gauge angiocatheter lines herself when the surgical resident was fumbling, her movements so smooth and certain that the patient never registered anyone else had touched him. The resident had watched her, hadn't said anything, but Elena saw the moment of recognition cross his face, the understanding that she was not what she appeared to be, that she knew something that was not in any nursing curriculum. She moved away before he could process it. And then Dr. Sterling walked into the emergency department. He arrived like weather, a presence that changed the air pressure in a room, that made people notice they had been breathing without thinking about it. His white coat was pristine, expensive-looking, the kind of white that comes from dry cleaning, not from actually doing work. His tie was silk. His shoes were Italian leather, the color of saddle brown, and they clicked against the tile floor with a sound like a metronome measuring time in 1-second intervals. He was tall, probably 6'2", with the kind of jawline that could cut glass and the kind of posture that suggested he had never once questioned whether he belonged in any room he entered. This was Dr. Sterling, the new chief of surgery, and he was moving through Sacred Heart's ER with the kind of confidence that comes not from competence but from institutional power, from the fact that his father had endowed a wing, that his brother-in-law was on the hospital board, that he had trained at Johns Hopkins and done a fellowship at Stanford, and that everyone in the room already knew this because someone had sent a memo. He was introduced to the staff by the current chief of medicine, a woman named Dr. Reeves who looked the way people look when they are trying very hard not to seem threatened. This is Dr. Sterling. He'll be taking over surgical oversight, effective immediately. He has some new protocols he'd like to implement. New protocols. Elena kept checking her patient's dressing, kept her eyes on her work, kept her shoulders at a neutral angle that suggested she was listening but not interested. Dr. Sterling's voice was like a tank idling in a garage, something with absolute weight behind it, something that could accelerate to devastating speed if he wanted it to. He talked about performance standards, efficiency metrics, chain of command. He used the phrase institutional hierarchy twice, and both times Elena heard the unspoken message, "I am in charge now, and everyone answers to me, and if you don't like that, there are people waiting for your job." He made eye contact with almost everyone in the room during those first 5 minutes. He looked at the attending physicians. He looked at the residents. He looked at the pharmacist and the respiratory therapist and the custodian who had come in to restock the supply cart. And then his gaze passed across Elena like a searchlight moving across water, landing on her for exactly 1 second, long enough to register that she was in the room, not long enough to actually see her, and then moving on. She was just a nurse. There were 18 of them working the ER that day. She was the one wearing navy scrubs that had faded from regular washing. She was the one whose badge did not have a title beyond RN. She was the one who had not made eye contact with him. He dismissed her with a glance, and Elena exhaled slowly, a breath so controlled that no one heard it, and she turned her attention back to her patients adjusting the flow rate on the pump with a gentleness that came from knowing that these small actions were the difference between pain and comfort, between infection and healing. But something had shifted. She could feel it the way a seismograph feels the first tremor of an earthquake still miles away. Something was coming, something was about to move, and the only question was whether she could keep her head down long enough to avoid it. The afternoon unfolded with the ordinary violence of emergency medicine. By 4 p.m., there had been 3 more traumas, a septic patient who needed to go to ICU, and a psychiatric patient who came in threatening to harm himself and spent 45 minutes in a holding room while psychiatry evaluated him. Elena moved through all of it with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything: check, document, assess, move to the next. She did not notice Dr. Sterling watching her from the doorway of Trauma Bay 1 when she positioned a patient for a central line. She did not see the way his expression shifted when her hands moved through the procedure without hesitation, without any of the second-guessing that characterized most nurses. She was simply doing her job. She was simply invisible. At 5:48 p.m., as her shift was ending, Elena returned to locker 347. She changed out of her scrubs, pulled on jeans and a black t-shirt, and closed the door on the plastic-wrapped boots without looking at them again. She clipped her badge to her bag, a habit, though no one was watching her leave, and took the stairwell down instead of the elevator because elevators required proximity, and proximity sometimes required conversation. The parking lot was hot. The sun was low and fierce. Elena walked to her car, a 2008 Honda Civic with 187,000 miles on the odometer, and she sat in the driver's seat for 2 minutes before starting the engine, her hands resting on the steering wheel, her eyes closed, doing what she had learned to do, let the day move through her without letting it stay. The next morning came early. Elena arrived at Sacred Heart at 6:58, the parking lot still dark, her badge clipped to her waistband, her scrubs pressed. The ER hummed with that pre-dawn quiet that never lasted, the moment before the machinery of 1,000 human crises started grinding. She moved through the corridors like she always did, invisible. At 7:15, during morning rounds, Dr. Sterling stood in the medication review area with a third-year resident, a nervous kid named Patterson who kept nodding like his head was on a spring. Sterling's voice carried the particular confidence of a man who'd never been questioned. He was reading dosages aloud, not looking at the charts, just performing his competence for the resident's benefit, a surgical theater of one. Elena approached quietly. She'd been a nurse for 3 years at Sacred Heart, and before that, she'd been something else entirely, but that life was sealed off, locked in a locker 3 floors down with a pair of worn combat boots wrapped in brown paper. She kept her voice low, professional, the voice she perfected, deferential, careful, the kind of voice that apologized for existing. Dr. Sterling, the dosage on bed 7. She paused, letting him acknowledge her. He didn't. That's 500 milligrams of. I'm sorry, did someone ask for nursing input on my prescriptions? Sterling looked up, his eyes moving through her like she was a window. The resident shifted. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a surgical white that made skin look like paper. Elena held his gaze for one measured breath. Then she stepped back. Sterling turned to Patterson with a theatrical sigh that belonged in a different kind of performance entirely. This is what happens when you let them think they're part of the decision-making process. They start second-guessing your orders. Next thing, they're telling you how to hold a scalpel. She walked away before he could see her jaw clench. By afternoon, Sterling had made his move. The nurses' station was crowded, 7 nurses charting, 2 residents reviewing labs, the smell of stale coffee and hand sanitizer hanging in the air like a permanent fixture. Sterling stood near the desk, casual as a predator, and his voice rose just enough to carry. I'll make this simple for everyone. The quiet one in the corner, Martinez, won't last a week under real surgical standards. Anyone want to take that bet? He smiled. It was the smile of a man used to winning. I'm serious. 10-1 odds she cracks by Friday. 3 nurses looked at the floor. 1 laughed nervously. Elena stood at the back of the station, moving between a patient file and the supply cart with mechanical precision. She didn't look up. Her breathing stayed level. She was used to absorbing impact without flinching, a skill learned in places where flinching could get people killed. But that wasn't the worst part. The next day at lunch rush, the cafeteria was chaos. 100 people moving between tables, trays clattering, conversations overlapping into white noise. Elena sat alone, as always, eating a chicken breast and steamed vegetables that tasted like nothing. She'd learned to eat for function, not pleasure. Fuel, not enjoyment. Sterling walked past carrying a coffee, moving through the crowd with the casual authority of someone who'd never had to apologize for taking up space. His elbow caught her tray, whether accident or design, the outcome was the same. The tray flew. Chicken and vegetables scattered across the tile floor. Water splashed across her scrubs, soaking into the fabric at her knees, cold and sudden. The room went dead silent. 50 eyes. Maybe more. Everyone watching to see what the quiet nurse would do. What she would break into. Sterling didn't break stride. He looked back over his shoulder with a smile like a knife held horizontally. Careful, sweetheart. You should watch where you put things. Elena kneeled. The tile was cold against her knees, still wet from the water and whatever else had spilled. She gathered the broken tray. Gathered the scattered food. Gathered the napkins. Her hands moved on their own, muscle memory taking over, steady as surgical instruments. She stood. Wiped her scrubs. And then she felt it, that single tear, escaping down her cheek like a prisoner finding a hole in the fence. She didn't brush it away. She let it fall while maintaining eye contact with Sterling, her eyes steady as a sniper's sight line. When she spoke, her voice came out like still water. Not loud. Not angry. Just a truth stated without commentary. I've carried better men than you through worse places than this. Sterling's smile faltered. Just for half a second. Just enough for the room to notice. His jaw tightened. He turned and walked away, but Elena saw his shoulders stiffen, saw the way his hand gripped the coffee cup harder than necessary. He'd expected her to cry. He'd expected collapse. Instead, she'd handed him something worse, the suggestion that he was beneath her, that his cruelty was the behavior of a small man. 2 days later, Sterling made his next move. Elena was walking out of the ICU at 6 in the evening, her shift ending, when Sterling appeared in the hallway, his white coat crisp, a patient chart in his hand. He waited until she was directly in front of him, then dropped the chart. Paper scattered across the tile floor like leaves, spreading in all directions. Pick that up, sweetheart. Or is bending over not in your skill set? Elena took one breath. Then she bent, gathering sheets one by one, stacking them carefully. The hallway was empty except for a resident at the far end who suddenly became very interested in a computer screen. Sterling leaned close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive, aggressive, chemical. His voice dropped into that particular register reserved for humiliation. You don't belong here. You're a placeholder. And I'm going to prove it. She stood. Handed him the reorganized chart, spine first, the way it should be held. Said nothing. She'd learned that silence was sometimes the most devastating weapon. It didn't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. It didn't give him material to work with. It just left him standing in the hallway with his words hanging in the air, unanswered and irrelevant. But that wasn't the worst part. At 1900 hours, the rotor wash announced itself before anything else, a rhythmic percussion that shook the windows on the 3rd floor and rattled the fluorescent light panels. Elena was in the supply closet on the ICU, counting endotracheal tubes, when the sound reached her. She didn't move. Helicopter arrivals were routine at Sacred Heart. Major trauma. Golden hour. Mobilization. The intercom crackled to life. Trauma alert. Level 1 activation. ETA 3 minutes. Coast Guard helicopter. Multiple trauma. The ICU erupted. Residents running. Nurses mobilizing. Beds being prepared. Elena set down the endotracheal tubes and walked to the central station. She didn't run. Running was for people who panicked. The patient arrived at 1914, wheeled in by 2 paramedics, his flight suit torn open, crush injuries visible across his torso, internal bleeding evident from the fluid already pooling beneath him on the stretcher. Commander Michael Cross, USCG. Late 40s. Wedding ring still on his left hand despite the damage. His vitals were dropping in real time, BP 120/80 when the helicopter took off, now 95/60. The intake nurse logged his belongings with clinical efficiency. Wallet. Watch. Wedding ring. Then she paused. His left forearm bore a tattoo, black ink faded by sun exposure and time. Military stencil lettering. For letters, Martinez. She mentioned it to the resident. He shrugged. Moved on. Elena was assigned to ICU bed 12. She entered at 2100 hours. The commander was unconscious, intubated, a ventilator pushing oxygen into his lungs in that distinctive rhythm that dominated the room. His chart was already thick with data. Trauma labs. Imaging results. Surgical consult pending. She began her assessment with the precision that came from muscle memory, blood pressure, heart rate, oxygen saturation, pupil response. She was moving with the steady focus of someone doing 1,000 times what she'd done 1,000 times before. Then her eyes landed on the tattoo. Her hand froze. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. The letters stared at her, Martinez. Military stencil. The kind of tattoo worn by people who wanted to carry someone with them everywhere they went. The kind of tattoo that meant something. She completed the assessment, logged the vitals, and left without another word. But her hands had started shaking in the supply closet 20 minutes later, gripping the shelf until her knuckles turned white, her breathing deliberately slowed, her voice a whisper that no one else was meant to hear. He doesn't know you. He can't know you. At midnight, his daughter arrived. Lieutenant Ashley Cross, Coast Guard dress uniform, face exhausted but composed with that particular military bearing, spine straight, shoulders back, the weight of rank and duty sitting on her shoulders like armor. She took her father's hand and whispered something Elena didn't hear. Elena brought her coffee without being asked. Set it on the bedside table with a steady hand. Left the room. Sterling appeared in the ICU at 1 in the morning, reviewing charts, and when he saw Elena's name assigned to bed 12, his smile widened into something that looked almost like satisfaction. He didn't know what was in that room. He didn't know what was about to walk through those doors in the next 72 hours. He thought he was still playing checkers with a woman who flinched at insults. He had no idea what was already in motion. The first sound Elena hears is not an alarm. It's the rotor wash, that distinctive percussion of a Black Hawk's rotors cutting the Houston humidity at 1900 hours, shaking the hospital's rooftop like distant artillery. She's restocking lidocaine vials in the ICU supply cart when the emergency alert crackles through the overhead speakers, trauma alert. Level 1 activation. Shipping accident victim. ETA for minutes. The doors to the elevators hiss open. 20 feet away, nurses and residents are already moving, grabbing trauma gowns, checking ventilator settings, pulling crash carts into position like a rehearsed ballet. Elena doesn't think. She simply abandons the supply cart and walks toward the motion, her footsteps quiet on the linoleum, joining the current of bodies flowing toward the rooftop landing pad. The wind up there is apocalyptic. The rotors are already slowing, but the rotor wash still feels like standing in a hurricane. Elena watches as the flight crew lowers a stretcher, a man's body strapped down and unconscious, falls running, a portable ventilator forcing breath into his lungs with mechanical precision. The uniform is unmistakable, Coast Guard dress blues, the fabric torn and soaked with seawater and something darker. The trauma team moves in formation. A resident is calling vitals. An attending physician is already scanning for visible injuries. Elena takes her place at the edges of the cluster, watching, waiting for the moment she'll be needed. This is where she belongs, not in the chaos of conscious patients demanding painkillers and arguing with insurance, but here, where everything distills down to breath and heartbeat and the single question of whether someone lives or dies in the next 60 minutes. They move him through the corridors in a 3-person carry, the stretcher rattling beneath its wheels. Someone's pager chirps. Another calls for O-negative blood to the trauma bay. The fluorescent lights overhead blur into streaks as they move, and Elena stays on the periphery, her hands ready, her breathing steady, watching everything. Bed 12. That's where they place him. Elena is assigned to vitals. She steps in smoothly, replacing the nurse who'd been monitoring him during the transport, and begins her own assessment. The commander is still sedated, the flight crew had intubated him, which means his arm lies slack at his side as she wraps the blood pressure cuff around his bicep. Systolic 110. Diastolic 70. The numbers are good. Too good, maybe, given what the CT scan will probably show. She reaches for his wrist to check his radial pulse and that's when she sees it. A tattoo. Black ink, faded and worn with time, running the length of his forearm in capital letters, Martinez. Elena's hands don't shake. They don't hesitate. She finds his pulse, 72, strong and steady, and continues her assessment as if she hasn't just recognized the code name of a woman from 7 years ago, a woman who no longer exists, a woman buried so deep under nursing scrubs and Houston humidity that she should never surface again. The pulse under her fingers feels like a memory trying to claw its way back through her skin. She documents the vitals. She adjusts his ventilator settings. She checks the 4 placements and confirms the medications dripping into his veins. Everything is routine. Everything is protocol. And everything about this moment is pulling her back to a coordinate in Kandahar where she'd carried this man, not knowing his name, only his weight and the fact that his blood was soaking into her uniform, toward a helicopter that was already taking fire. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that her hands remembered. Muscle memory is supposed to be athletic, serving a tennis ball, landing a punch, catching a falling person before they hit concrete. But Elena's hands remembered field medicine. They moved through the assessment with the kind of precision that comes from practicing in the dark under mortar fire, from knowing that hesitation kills. She checked for compartment syndrome in his legs. She palpated his abdomen for signs of internal bleeding. She listened to his lungs for fluid accumulation and heard only clear bilateral air movement, the sound like wind through an empty building. A resident, a young man with coffee stains on his white coat and bags under his eyes, watched her work for nearly 3 minutes before saying anything. Then, "You've done this before." Elena didn't look up from her assessment. Everyone's done this before if they work trauma long enough. But that was a lie. Most nurses follow the trauma protocol. Elena was reading the commander's body like text in a language only certain people ever learned to speak. She was noticing things that hadn't made it into the CT scan yet, a slight pallor around his lips, the faintest tremor in his breathing pattern, a quality to his heartbeat that was almost imperceptible unless you'd spent 6 years listening to that specific sound in the dark. She'd spent 6 years listening. At 18:30 hours, the CT results came back negative for major internal injuries. The shipping accident had thrown him against a steel railing, cracked 2 ribs, but missed his organs. The surgical team was confident he'd survive. They moved him to the ICU for monitoring. Elena was assigned to his care for the night shift. As the rest of the ward settled into its evening rhythm, machines beeping in steady patterns, nurses passing medications in white paper cups, families saying goodbyes at visiting hours, Elena sat at the monitoring station and watched the commander's vital signs scroll across the screen like lines of a confession she couldn't stop reading. 1900 hours became 2000 hours. The shift had been running for 3 hours when Elena felt the first cold finger of awareness at the base of her spine. Dr. Sterling had appeared at the ICU entrance around 1930, observed her with the commander for exactly 4 minutes, then turned and walked away with his phone already at his ear. Elena had learned to read the architecture of institutional power long before she became a nurse. She recognized the posture of a man making calls. She recognized the expression of someone arranging a board. By 2000 hours, Sterling was meeting with the surgical team in the hallway outside bed 12. Elena heard phrases like scope of practice and appropriate protocols and need to establish clear chain of command. The surgical attending, a thoracic specialist named Harrison who'd consulted on the commander's case, looked uncomfortable. "The nurse seems competent," she heard Harrison say. "Competence isn't the issue," Sterling replied. His voice was the voice of a man rearranging chess pieces. "The issue is that this patient is a priority case. Navy liability, potential federal scrutiny. I'm going to personally oversee his care. I want to limit his exposure to unnecessary personnel." Elena watched him make 3 more calls that evening. Each one shorter than the last. Each one more confident. By 2200 hours, the night nurse who was supposed to relieve her for the remaining hours had texted that her shift was cancelled, the hospital was implementing a temporary staffing freeze due to budget constraints, and all ICU nurses were being consolidated. Elena would work through the night. She alone would be responsible for bed 12. This was when she understood Sterling had arranged it perfectly. He'd observed her competence and recognized it as a threat. He'd seen her hands move with the kind of authority that didn't match her badge title, and rather than let her continue, he was isolating her, putting her in a position where she'd be utterly exposed if anything went wrong. If the commander deteriorated, if there was an emergency, there would be no one to corroborate what happened, no witnesses to her actions, nothing but Elena's word against the institutional weight of Sacred Heart's medical hierarchy. He was setting a trap. He just didn't know who he was trapping. Elena settled into the chair beside bed 12 and prepared for a long night. The commander's vitals remained stable. His monitors beat their steady rhythm. In the darkness, with only the glow of the screens illuminating her face, Elena sat very still and waited for whatever came next. The tattooed forearm on the bed, the one with her old name written in ink that predated her nursing license by 7 years, lay palm down in the surgical lights, exposed and still as a photograph of another life. She didn't close her eyes. Senior chief petty officers didn't take risks with high-value patients on night watches. They stayed alert. They stayed ready. They waited for the other shoe to drop, because in Elena's experience, the other shoe always dropped eventually. And when it did, there would be no one coming to help her. There would be no one at all. The heart monitor's alarm cut through the darkness at 01 for 7 hours like a siren made of pure electricity. Elena's eyes snapped open. She'd been charting at the bedside desk, watching Commander Cross's steady breathing, watching the soft rise and fall of his chest. The vitals had been stable all night. Textbook stable. Boring stable. Not anymore. Blood pressure 110/70 dropped to 105/68 in 5 seconds. Then 95/60. The numbers falling like a stone down a well. Elena moved before her brain caught up to what her hands already knew. She was on her feet, fingers on the monitor, reading the wave pattern. The rhythm was there, sinus, regular, perfect. But something was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. 80/50. The world narrowing down to a single objective, keep him alive until help arrived. "I need the attending," she said into the overhead, her voice steady, conversational, the way you'd order coffee. "Commander Cross, bed 12, BP dropping. Now." Static. Then, all surgical staff have been pulled for emergency credentialing review. Dr. Sterling scheduled a mandatory meeting at 01 for 5. "You'll need to contact." Elena cut the line. No one was coming. She understood that in the same moment she understood the blood pressure wouldn't stabilize. The numbers didn't lie. The pattern didn't lie. She'd seen this before, 8,000 kilometers away, under a sky that never got fully dark, in a compound where the walls had bullet holes the size of fists. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the space around the heart, squeezing it, choking it, drowning it from the outside in. The attending was in a meeting. The surgical team was in a meeting. 20 doctors pulled from the floor at the precise moment this man needed every one of them. The coincidence was so perfect it wasn't a coincidence at all. It was an architect's blueprint. It was a trap with her name written on it in Sterling's handwriting. Elena's jaw clenched once. Then released. She moved to the supply cabinet and began pulling what she needed, a 14-gauge needle, an 18-gauge angiocath, sterile field setup, a drainage bag. Her hands weren't shaking. Her hands never shook anymore. That was one of the lies she'd learned to tell herself, that the trembling was gone, that she was healed, that the muscle memory had faded into something manageable. It hadn't faded. It had just been waiting. Commander Cross opened his eyes as she swabbed his chest with betadine. The solution turned his skin the color of old copper. "What's?" he started, breathing shallow. "Stay still," Elena said. "Don't talk. Don't move. Let me work." She found the landmarks with her fingertips, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her fingers read his body the way a musician reads sheet music, every note exact, every space meaningful. Pain was information. Pain was data. And right now, his pain was telling her exactly where to go. The needle slid in smooth as a key turning in a lock. There was resistance at first, tissue, fascia, the tough membrane surrounding the heart. Then a subtle give, like breaking through an eggshell. She advanced the angiocath and felt the change in pressure, the give of the pericardial sac. Blood filled the chamber. Not normal. Not a drop or two. 200 cc of blood came back into the syringe in one long, terrible pull, dark blood, the color of old wine, pooling in the bag hanging at the needle hub. His blood pressure was climbing even as she drew. 85/52 became 92/58. The heart, released from the squeeze, began to pump again. "That's it," she whispered. Not to him. To something older than words. To the part of her that had done this in the dark, in the dust, with mortar rounds landing close enough to shake dirt from the ceiling. "That's it. Come back. 100/65. 105/68. The numbers climbing home. She secured the angiocath with careful hands and hung a fresh bag at the needle hub to drain any fluid that continued to accumulate. Commander Cross's breathing was slower now, deeper. The panic draining from his face along with the blood draining from his pericardium. His eyes found hers for a moment, a second where the recognition almost happened, almost broke the surface of things, before consciousness slipped back under. The silence that followed was the worst kind. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the presence of everything she'd just done wrong. Elena heard the footsteps before the door opened. Measured. Confident. A man walking toward something he'd already won. Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway with his hands in his coat pockets and his eyes doing that thing they did, scanning for weakness, cataloguing failures, designing the next move. He looked at Elena. He looked at the needle site. He looked at the bag draining dark blood from a commander's pericardium. Then he smiled. "Call HR," he said to someone in the hallway. "Not as a request. Tell them I'm bringing her in at 0600. He turned and walked away, still smiling, the victory so complete it didn't need a voice to announce it. Elena didn't watch him go. She watched her hands finish securing the drain line. She watched them dispose of the needle in the sharps container with the precision of muscle memory. She watched them move like they belonged to someone else entirely, someone who'd learned to do impossible things and then had to learn how to live with the cost. By sunrise, she'd already collected the evidence against herself. Dr. Sterling had sent an email by 0300 hours requesting a full file review from the temp agency that had placed her 3 years ago. By 0400, he'd contacted 3 board members with preliminary concerns about her credentials. By 0500, he'd brought in an outside investigator who didn't know her name or her history or the reason she'd chosen to disappear into a nursing scrubs and a quiet ER where no one looked too carefully and no one asked questions that mattered. He was good. He was thorough. He was the kind of architect who built his structures from other people's ruin. By 0545, Elena walked into the HR office on the 2nd floor. The room smelled like industrial carpet and the kind of fear that comes from institutional power. Dr. Sterling sat at the head of the table in a chair that cost more than Elena's car. Next to him, a chief compliance officer whose name tag read Patricia Walsh, and an attorney in a suit that probably paid for itself in a single consultation. "Ms. Martinez," the attorney began, "Dr. Sterling has raised concerns about an incident occurring approximately 4 hours ago in which you performed an invasive surgical procedure, specifically, a pericardiocentesis, without physician supervision or—" "He was dying," Elena said. Her voice was quiet. Calm. The voice of someone who had already accepted the cost. "I drew 200 cubic centimeters of blood from his pericardial sac. He was in cardiogenic shock. No one was coming. I saved his life. That's my statement." Sterling leaned back in his chair. "Your credentials show you became a registered nurse only 3 years ago. Before that, your employment history shows gaps. Significant gaps. Your references from the temp agency are incomplete. You don't have a supervisor who can speak to your background. And just now, you performed a procedure that requires surgical certification and physician oversight." He slid a folder across the table the way a hunter drops a trophy at the feet of someone who hasn't earned it. "I've contacted the temp agency directly," he continued. "I've requested an external review of your nursing license. I've briefed 3 board members about the liability exposure here. And I've brought in an investigator licensed by the Texas Medical Board. Walsh cleared her throat. Pending the outcome of this investigation, you're suspended effective immediately. We'll need your hospital badge, your access card, and your parking pass. Elena reached for the badge hanging around her neck. The plastic was worn smooth from 3 years of her hands pulling it up to scan doors, to clock in, to prove she belonged to this place even though she never had. She set it on the table, watched it settle there like an anchor dropping into deeper water. Nobody spoke as she walked out. The rain started before she reached the cemetery. Not a warning drizzle. Actual rain, the kind that came with thunder that sounded like furniture moving in the sky, the kind that looked personal. Elena's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she drove toward Greenwood Cemetery on the east side of Houston, toward the section where the grass grew softer and the stones grew quieter. The headstone was granite the color of wet slate. Lieutenant David Martinez, U.S. Navy, 1985 to 2020. 2 years carved in stone. 3 years of her breathing above it, walking around it, laying flowers against it in the early morning when no one was watching. She knelt in the mud. Her scrubs were still damp from the ER, still carrying the smell of antiseptic and fear and the particular chemical signature of a man's life measured in blood volume. The rain ran down her face and soaked into her hair and made the world into something softer than it had been that morning. I tried to stay hidden, she whispered. Like you asked. You said I needed time to heal. To let go. To disappear for a while. To be nobody. She placed her hand on the stone. Her fingers traced the letters of his name. I thought I could do this. Be normal. Be just another nurse in just another hospital. Nobody looking twice. Nobody asking what was underneath. The rain fell harder. But I failed again. I can't stop being who I am, even when it costs me everything. Even when it burns it all down. Her voice cracked on the edges of words she didn't know how to speak. I don't know how to be small anymore, David. I don't know how to be invisible. It's not in what I'm made of. She stayed there until the light went thick and the rain started to smell like evening. When she finally stood, her knees ached and her hands were numb and something inside her had shifted, some weight that had been sitting on her chest for 3 years finally allowed to settle somewhere else. That night, Sterling received his confirmation. The investigator sent a report, employment gaps, minimal references, nursing license issued suspiciously late, no verifiable background prior to 3 years ago. Sterling scheduled her termination hearing for 3 days out. Enough time to build a case so tight even the best lawyer couldn't pry it open. He told a colleague in the hallway, she'll be gone by Friday. And I'll make sure no hospital in Texas will touch her again. He meant it. What he didn't know was that 3 days would be long enough for a commander to wake up. 3 days would be long enough for a name tattooed on a forearm in Kandahar to finally connect to the hands that had saved it. 3 days would be long enough for the real architect to step in, and Sterling's perfect structure was about to crumble into ash. The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar song as Elena sat in the Human Resources office at Sacred Heart, waiting. She didn't fidget. Her hands lay flat on her lap, palms down, the way she'd learned to sit in briefing rooms where weakness was a liability. Across the desk, Chief Compliance Officer Patricia Vance shuffled papers with the precision of someone building a case, and beside her sat the hospital's attorney, Marcus Webb, whose expression suggested he'd already decided the outcome before Elena walked through the door. Dr. Sterling entered at 0930 hours exactly. He was composed, almost cheerful, the way a surgeon looks when he knows the anatomy of the kill. He carried a folder thick with documents, and Elena recognized the weight of it, the accumulation of 3 days spent constructing a narrative that sounded medically sound even though everyone in this room knew the truth was something else entirely. Ms. Martinez, Sterling began, not meeting her eyes, which meant he was performing for the compliance officer and the attorney, not for her. The procedure you performed on Commander Cross at 0247 hours on the morning of the 15th was a pericardiocentesis. A surgical intervention. Specifically, a needle decompression of the pericardial sac to relieve cardiac tamponade. He paused, letting the weight of the medical terminology settle. You are a registered nurse with a general care license. You are not a physician. You are not a nurse practitioner. You are not an advanced practice provider of any classification. The state of Texas Board of Nursing maintains clear scope of practice limitations. Patricia Vance nodded along, making notes. The attorney reviewed the documents Sterling had prepared. Elena watched Sterling's hands as he talked. They moved with the confidence of someone who believed his own narrative completely. That was his strength and his critical vulnerability. He believed he was right because he'd constructed an edifice of policy and procedure that seemed airtight from the outside. He didn't understand that edifices crumble when the foundation is built on sand. The patient's condition deteriorated in the absence of appropriate medical supervision, Sterling continued, his voice taking on the clinical detachment of testimony. If this procedure had failed, if you had nicked the myocardium, if you had introduced an infection during a sterile intervention, the liability to Sacred Heart would have been catastrophic. The patient could have died. He should have died, frankly. That he didn't doesn't change the fact that protocol was violated. That's not accurate, Elena said quietly. For words. She'd learned long ago that more words diluted authority. The room went still. Sterling's jaw tightened. The attorney looked up from his folder. Patricia Vance's pen hovered above her notepad. I'm sorry. Sterling's voice carried the edge of a knife. 20 doctors. Elena's eyes moved from Sterling to Patricia to Webb, steady and level. Every surgical staff member on night shift was reassigned or called to an emergency meeting that was scheduled at 01 for 6 hours. 14 minutes before the commander's pressure began dropping. The code blue went out. No one came. 20 doctors abandoned a patient with a failing cardiac output. There was a necessary administrative, Sterling began. 20 doctors, Elena repeated, her voice like still water. I stood in that room alone. The commander had 80 milliliters of blood collecting around his heart. His blood pressure was 54/32. His heart rate was 142. If I had waited for one of those 20 doctors to appear, if I had called for help and waited for someone with the right title to arrive, his ejection fraction would have been 0, and he would have been dead inside of 4 minutes. That's not scope of practice. That's triage. That's keeping someone alive when the system fails them. Patricia Vance and Marcus Webb exchanged a glance. Sterling's composure flickered for exactly 1/2 second before he reasserted control. That doesn't change the regulatory violation, he said, but his voice had lost some of its clinical precision. The commander is alive, Elena said, and then she stopped talking. Silence was a weapon she knew how to use. Patricia Vance shifted in her chair. The attorney made a note. Sterling opened his mouth, then closed it, recognizing that he'd already made his point and anything else would be repetition. What happened next happened quickly and with the inevitability of dominoes falling in a pattern that had been set in motion the moment Sterling decided that policy mattered more than lives. Patricia and the attorney conferred in low voices. The decision was made not because they believed Sterling, but because he had the authority structure on his side. The hospital's liability insurance required them to suspend Elena pending investigation. It was procedural. It was protective. It was cowardice dressed up as compliance. Effective immediately, Patricia said, sliding a letter across the desk, you are placed on unpaid suspension pending investigation into the scope of practice violation. This suspension is not a termination. During this time, you will have no access to hospital facilities, no clinical duties, and no contact with patients. We will conduct a full review of your credentials and the circumstances of the procedure. You'll be notified of our findings within 14 business days. Elena took the letter without looking at it. She already knew what it said. That evening, she stood in Glenwood Cemetery on the west side of Houston, rain hammering the earth like applause for the dead. Her scrubs were soaked through, clinging to her skin, rain running down her face and mixing with salt water she wasn't aware she was producing until she felt the sting of it in her eyes. David's grave was exactly where she'd left it 3 years ago. Section D, row 18, plot for a granite stone with his name and dates, and no explanation of how a man could go from commander of a vessel to 6 feet under because his heart decided to betray him in a hospital bed. I tried, she whispered to the rain and the stone and the ghost she'd been running from for 3 years. I tried to stay hidden like you asked me to. I tried to disappear. I tried to be just a nurse, just a person no one would look at twice. I tried. The rain soaked deeper, and Elena realized she was kneeling now, her hands pressed against the sodden earth. Her voice dropped lower, barely audible over the sound of water running in rivulets between the graves. But I failed again. I can't help it. When something's broken, I fix it. When someone's dying, I stand up. When someone's pushing me down, I don't break. She pressed her forehead against the rain-dark stone. I can't disappear, David. I've tried for 3 years and I can't disappear. That's not who I am. That was never who I am. The silence that followed lasted exactly 90 seconds, and then the rain intensified, and Elena understood that she had just surrendered to something larger than survival. She had surrendered to the truth that a person cannot shed their own bones. That what you carry in your muscle memory stays with you whether you want it to or not. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop running from yourself. 3 days later, Elena received an email from hospital security, marked with the administrative coldness of an institution protecting itself from liability. The subject line read, "Instruction to collect personal effects." She was to report to Commander Cross's room in ICU at 1,400 hours with an escort. It was presented as a courtesy, they would retrieve her items for her, but Elena understood it for what it was, a final humiliation. The security escort would ensure she didn't access anything else, didn't contaminate the scene, didn't do anything unauthorized. It was the hospital's way of closing the door on her. She climbed the stairs instead of taking the elevator, wanting to feel her body moving through the building one last time. The hospital smelled like it always did, antiseptic and fear, fluorescent light and synthetic hope. Her shoes made quiet sounds on the polished tile, 1, 2, 3, 4, the rhythm of a walk that had nothing to do with hurry. The security guard, a man named Torres, met her at the ICU entrance. He was younger, maybe 28, with a kind of careful politeness that suggested he'd been briefed on who she was and what she'd supposedly done. They walked together in silence to bed 12, and Torres stood by the door, giving her a few minutes of privacy, as if kindness could soften the edges of what was happening. Commander Cross was awake. His color had returned, pink instead of the grey-blue of cardiac compromise. His breathing was easy, regular, the sound of a man whose heart had remembered how to do its job. He watched as Elena reached for her stethoscope, which lay coiled on the bedside table next to a water pitcher and a vase of flowers that hadn't been there before. Her fingers were 6 inches from the earpieces when his eyes focused, really focused, on her face for the first time since the emergency. One word. Barely a whisper. A word that should have meant nothing to anyone in that room. Reaper. Elena's hand stopped. The world compressed into the space between her ribs where her heart was attempting to restart something it had shut down 3 years ago. She had been called that name exactly once, in the dark of a landing zone under fire, when someone was screaming that they needed extraction and she was the only one running toward the sound instead of away from it. The door opened wider. A woman in a Coast Guard dress uniform stepped into the room, and Elena recognized the shape of the commander's face in her features, his daughter, probably, maybe late 20s, moving with the specific discipline of someone who'd spent years learning to carry authority without wearing it like armor. The woman's eyes went wide, and she took a single step forward, her voice cracking on 2 words, Senior Chief. Elena felt something inside her shift, a tectonic movement of the continents, the kind that causes earthquakes. The woman knew. Not from records, not from assumption, but from recognition of something written in the bones of someone who'd survived. My father's tattoo, the woman said, and her voice was shaking now, the military discipline failing in the face of something larger. Martinez. Your name. I've been trying to figure out why he had, she stopped, understanding crossing her face like sunrise. You're the one who carried him out. Kandahar, Elena said. Not a question. A statement of fact. 7 years, the woman continued, tears now running down her face in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the specific reverence people have for legends they didn't think were real. The landing zone was hot. 20 meters of exposed ground. He was hit twice, and you ran into active fire, and you carried him. Her voice broke completely. You carried him 200 meters uphill under fire while he was unconscious, and you flagged down the evac helicopter, and you handed him off, and then you disappeared. Torres, the security guard, stood frozen in the doorway, unsure if he should stay or leave, if this was authorized or if something larger than protocol was unfolding in front of him. Elena stood motionless, her hand finally closing around her stethoscope. The boots downstairs in her locker 3 floors down, the ones with mud still in the treads from Kandahar, suddenly felt like they were standing in this room with her, announcing themselves without words. What happens now? Elena asked quietly. She wasn't asking Torres. She wasn't asking the commander or his daughter. She was asking herself, and the question hung in the air like humidity in Houston summer, heavy, inescapable, containing the weight of all the decisions that had brought her to this moment. The commander's daughter stepped closer, and when she spoke, her voice had moved from shock into something steady, something that sounded like a command. Now you stop pretending to be someone you're not. That's where we'll pick up next, because the next 24 hours will decide whether Elena Martinez walks out of Sacred Heart the same person who walked in 3 years ago, or whether the woman she'd buried with her boots in a locker is finally, irrevocably, about to stand up. If you've made it this far, you understand that heroes don't always announce themselves. Some stand quietly in hospital corridors wearing scrubs and a name tag that hides a Navy cross. Subscribe to see what happens when the world finally recognizes who's been standing beside it all along. Like this video if you believe some people are worth fighting for, even when they're fighting to disappear. And comment, what would you do if the person you'd risked everything to save walked past you every single day and didn't even recognize you?